The views and opinions expressed during this live stream do not necessarily represent the views of Framing the World. Individuals are invited to be interviewed for their unique perspective on specific topics, and not because Framing the World agrees with or endorses all other areas of opinion. Listener discretion is advised.
With boys, they need, especially at a very young age, I'm talking 2, 3, 4, they need to have that father influence because dad's roughhouse with their boys. They're a little, they do the jungle gym thing, jump on daddy's backs, dad swings them around. And this is something that daddies do more than moms. Moms are the cautious ones, like, oh, don't do that, you're going to bonk his head, So the daddies are the ones that do that. But what it teaches a developing mind is risk-taking in a safe environment. So it allows for the child to understand that there is a thrill to taking risks, but without that child getting hurt from those risks. So seeing the limitations of the risks. So when that part is removed, that developing child becomes more withdrawn, and they are more afraid to take those risks. So they are less likely to be in that alpha role of leadership, and more likely to kind of be in the sidelines, which is so many men are these days, just kind of in the shadow, and too afraid to take that thrill and that risk because of the potential of harm.
All right, guys. Well, today's episode is going to be something that is a little different than what we talked about on the show thus far. We're going to be talking about mental health. We're going to be talking about children's suicide and just a variety of different issues. It really just depends on how much time we have. But I would like to talk about how, the risks of enrolling yourself into a mental institution and, the risks of hospitalization, how you get out of the mental hospital and stuff like that. So we're going to talk to Sarah Wallace here in a little bit. Sarah was interviewed on this program back in late October. She talked about hospice, sick, old, and dying alone. So it was a fantastic interview that we did a few weeks ago. But we're going to get her back on the show here in a little bit to talk about mental health. It's a subject that's very interesting, and she's very passionate about the subject. So we're going to get her back on to talk about that issue today. I have a whole list of stuff I want to talk to her about, but just depending on time, we'll see where we get. We might have to do another interview with her later down the road. So that's not a horrible thing as well. So I want to quickly thank the sponsors of the show, the Romans Road app. Make sure you download that app if you get a chance. Also, I want to thank the donors to the show, the people who actually go to our website and donate through the link provided on our website. If you just go down on the left-hand side, there are 2 donations. You can donate to the show right here. So I wanted to thank quickly Kimberly Gandara, Matt Powell. I really appreciate Matt for donating the other day. Matt, thank you so much. Bass Lawson, Michael and Leslie Beardsley, Clive Hagan, Sarah Wallace, Chad Denyon, Sarah Wallace. So thank you, Sarah. You supporting your own show here. Josh Ludsford, Robert Kearney, Andrew Harms, Preston Taylor, Justin Schwartz, Ethan Schmidt, Walter Rodriguez, Kay Kuntz, Julio Filez, Julio Guerrero, Samuel Elliott, Christian Cumby, in memory of Timothy Cafone and Infectious Services. So I appreciate you guys supporting us on this show. We need to purchase 3 more hard drives on this show. Luckily, Matt made a very generous donation the other day, so he was able to buy about a hard drive and a half for us, and I really appreciate him supporting this channel. But we still need a couple more hard drives, guys. So if you can support us, that would be a huge blessing through the website there. Also, another way to support us is to pre-order these new shirts I have on the store. So if you click on t-shirts and then conspiracy or Christian, these are the new designs that I have on the website. I love how these shirts turned out. So anyways, guys, thanks so much for supporting the stream. Let's get right into today's program. We're going to get Sarah on the line here right now. Sarah, how you doing today?
Excellent. How are you?
Good. So why don't you start off by just telling us what we're going to be talking about today?
Well, we had some conversation about my experience in the mental health field, and one of the topics that came up was the increased rate of suicide among young boys, especially 12 and under, also in teenagers, but it's becoming a growing concern with the younger crowd as well. And just to talk a little bit about some of the causes that are leading up to these increased rates.
Yeah, because you were showing me some research through emails, and it was pretty fascinating. I was able to read through all the articles that you sent me, and it's pretty fascinating to know that, men are more susceptible to suicide and stuff like that. So I want to go into that and break down all the different things that it's a topic that I don't really know too much about. So I think, I'm going to learn a lot today, and I think the audience will as well.
Yeah, and some of the things that I know is from my own research. Other things is just from what I've seen firsthand. I worked at a mental hospital for 5 years. I worked predominantly with children. I was a case manager on the children's unit, so that's 12 and under, as long as they're out of, before they go into middle school. Once they go to middle school, they went to the adolescent unit. And I worked hand in hand with a brilliant psychiatrist who taught me a lot about the medications he uses and the decisions he was making. But even in that regard, it was very medication focused. But spending 5 years there, noticed a lot of patterns. And I moved on to doing nurse education for nursing students. I taught mental health to nursing students. And I would say to them, you can categorize these children into collective groups. If I had spent the time and the energy and effort to do that, I really could have just put each child in one of 12 groups based on their environment, their history, and presentation. But this is one of the groups, which is the suicidal boy, or the ones that lead to suicide are the boys that can't regulate their emotions. So that's kind of what I want to talk about, what that means and why that happens.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it and just kind of start us off with why this topic's important and just get right into it.
This is something that's been ongoing for a long time, and it kind of started with the breakdown of the family unit. So a child has the most potential for success when they're in a household that has a mother and a father that are together, and that one of them is home. Usually the mother is home with the child. And that's where the position we were in for generations until we had the feminist movement, the push for women to go to work. And from there, things just kind of corroded and deteriorated more and more to the point that we're at now. And one of the great references that I go to is Dr. Warren Farrell. He has a YouTube channel where he talks about a lot of boy issues. He's done extensive research into problems that boys face. And he had written a book called The Boy Crisis, and I'm just reading the statistics off the website, but he brought up some valid points about how if boys are 50% less likely to be proficient in math, reading, and science in the school curriculum. When once suicide was equal, the suicide rates were equal among boys and girls. Boys are now 6 times more likely to try to attempt suicide. They're more likely to grow delinquent in homes where there's no fathers. There's a lot less fathers involved in raising boys. And the big thing that I hadn't thought of before this was also they're losing their sense of purpose because they no longer have that role of leadership. This is definitely something that's predominant in the Christian faith. You know, the man is the spiritual leader and the provider and the protector, but that's gone wayside on any other secular situation. You know, it's all about feminine empowerment, and men are expected to, praise women for being as strong as they are, but not really have any other role besides sitting in the back seat and giving them a thumbs up. So we're not really seeing them having a purpose anymore. And our younger crowds are getting lost in that. They don't know what to do. There's so many children that grow up not knowing where to go with themselves in their lives.
Yeah, it almost seems like women today, they don't want to step up for that role because it seems like they're being put in the back seat. But really, it's the most important job out there for a woman is to, guide the house.
Well, and it's not fair for women either, unfortunately. I mean, I'm in the same position. It's what they're taught. I mean, this is the narrative that is infiltrated all aspects of visual entertainment, of textbook education. Predominantly every teacher you have in school is a woman. Yeah. So there's so much exposure to women in roles, and there's always the discussion, even from kindergarten, what do you want to be when you grow up? And there's no one that be a housewife. I want to be a supporter to my husband. It's just not a discussion that's had anymore. And so unfortunately, these women, unless they are growing up in Christian households, unless they are removed from that exposure, are not given a fair shake because this is where they're told that they have to perform.
Yeah. And it all falls back onto the children. And then, who's taking care of the children? The schools, other people. And so you kind of put your children in the hands of other people to raise them instead of guiding them lovingly. And so that's what I want to get into, is some of these facts about why little boys are more suicidal, it seems, now than even when I was a kid. Can you explain why? Give some pointers to why that is, and then go into each one?
Yeah, it's multifaceted. So I think what it stems back to is, and this is more for children 12 and under. I will say there's always a caveat. There's always an exception, but I'm talking about the majority. When you get into high school, you're dealing with bullying and social interactions. That isn't so much, there's all these variables that come into play that can lead to suicide, but it starts with 12 and under. And the proponents to cause this level of despair develop at that earlier age. It's the main influencing factor is a lack of proper parenting in the home, meaning that there's a lack of support to the child, a lack of a parent being available mentally and physically when they're needed, because they're either exhausted from work or at work or watching the television, and then a lack of fathering, especially with boys. Dr. Warren Farrell talked about this. I thought it was really fascinating. But with boys, they need, especially at a very young age, I'm talking 2, 3, 4, they need to have that father influence, because dad's roughhouse with their boys. They're a little, they do the jungle gym thing, jump on daddy's backs, dad swings them around. And this is something that daddies do more than moms. Moms are the cautious ones, like, oh, don't do that, you're going to bonk his head, So the daddies are the ones that do that. But what it teaches a developing mind is risk taking in a safe environment. So it allows for the child to understand that there is a thrill to taking risks, but without that child getting hurt from those risks or seeing the limitations of the risks. So when that part is removed, and all you have is the mother's influence when the father's absent, and you just have the mother's influence. Mothers are more naturally the protectors. They protect the home, the nest. And so they are the ones that pull back and hold the child close and say, okay, don't go out into the world because it's a dangerous place. So that developing child becomes more withdrawn, and they are more afraid to take those risks. So they are less likely to be in that alpha role of leadership, and more likely to kind of be in the sidelines, which is so many men are these days, just kind of in the shadow, and too afraid to take that thrill and that risk because of the potential of harm. So that is a huge factor into how they continue to develop throughout their youth. But also just there's so much that a father can do and needs to do for that developing mind that isn't really considered when you divorce. The mom thinks, I can take care of it because I don't know. I mean, as a woman myself, I had that mentality. Like I had this handled. Dad doesn't really need, I can do all the diapers. I can do all that. I don't really need dad around. But it's important. He's definitely important to the developing mind. So they also, unfortunately, when the father isn't around, lose a lot of male role models. Like I said, a lot of the women a lot of the teachers in the schools are women. Usually they might have boyfriends, like the moms might have boyfriends, but they are in and out. So the child might have attachment issues to other men. If they're not involved in a church that has a pastor, they don't really have any exposure to any male in a leadership role because they don't have a father. So they don't know how to express themselves in a male way. They don't know how to express their feelings and emotions because they haven't been able to watch someone else do it to imitate. They only are with women, and the way men express their feelings is different than women, and the way men react to things is different than women. So you need to have that male exposure that they lack.
Yeah, and another thing is child sexual abuse goes up too when they marry a second spouse. Do you know much about that?
Yes. Yeah, it's really unfortunate because that just changes everything. Once they get to the point that there's sexual abuse involved, they're pretty much in the system, in the mental health system, especially depending on the extent, the lengths that the sexual abuse occurred. It really changes the mentality of a young child and how they react to the world. For example, the one boy that we had admitted to he kept coming back. He was a frequent flyer. He was in the mental hospital all the time, but he was photographed by his grandmother and her neighbor in sexual positions. I guess they were selling the photos or making money off of it. And that made him afraid of light, bright spaces. He liked being in the dark. So it does definitely affect the psyche. And that's just one more thing. I mean, and that's an extreme condition. Of course, if a child is sexually abused, we would kind of expect them to have mental issues that would cause them to be suicidal. But even if they're in a household where you think that it's a pretty normal situation and no harm has really befell them, if they're not able to express themselves, it can build up into these issues. it can exhibit in other mental health ways as well. So like I said, what we call it is their inability to regulate. They get emotions, and boys like to, they lash out. So you often see boys, when they get angry, they're the ones that, knock stuff over and, go, rah, they get really mad, as opposed to girls. You see it more with boys. And it's good to sit down and talk to them and say, tell me why you're feeling this way. Let's talk about these feelings, so that they can think about them and reflect on them more than they do. But most parents are just like, go to your room, stop acting this way, go to your room. Come back out when you've calmed down. There isn't really a discussion. And so nobody's really looking to the root cause of why is this anger there? Why is he struggling so much? But you'll see it in other symptoms. So we put diagnoses on them, like ADHD. A lot of times there's a lack of attention. I think a lot of that is also because a lot of these school curriculums are designed by women. So they're for the learning minds that are more on the female side. And I think that's why boys struggle so much in school too, because they're not given enough breaks, enough physical activity. But that's another topic. And then the other thing is oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, which is the inability to regulate. Basically, oppositional defiant disorder is a boy lashes out in an extreme way beyond what would be expected. So if you say, if you can't finish your dinner, you won't have dessert, and a normal child will process that one way, and a child with oppositional defiant disorder will punch a hole in the wall. Like, they cannot control their anger. And that's just another example of, so often these kids that come in with that diagnosis just cannot express why they feel the way they do. They have no understanding of their own emotions or what they mean, because they never were able to have that broken down for them.
How do they get to that point where they become that way, though? Because most kids, if they grow up, they're totally normal. How do they get to that point? What's the leading cause to get to that point?
Well, most kids that I've seen, and I'm only going off, I don't know if there's so few studies on things like this. There's so much about mental health that hasn't really been explored. So much is assumed, and then they just say, okay, that's enough. And then they use it to develop a plan of care, and they move on, and not much more is looked into it. So I know when I've looked into this before, I haven't seen a whole lot as far as formal studies as that would cause propensity for oppositional defiant disorder. But I can tell you what I've seen in my own studies over the 5 years I worked with children, which is that the majority of those children that have ODD are either in foster care or have no fathers and absent mothers. And when I talk about no fathers and absent mothers, they have fathers are completely out of the picture, like no visitation, anything. They're just completely under the care of their mothers, and their mothers are usually either have their own mental health issues, have a neglectful propensity, or they just work and are too focused on themselves to really give that attention that's needed for the child. So the child's never able to really develop healthy communication skills. Those are the ones that the oppositional defiant disorder ones we see back over and over again, because the moms don't know how to handle them. They get to this point and it's like, and you get to a point where you think, how do I fix this anymore? It's just hard to see a way back from that. And they do struggle for years, even if you turn everything around, which often the mothers don't. But even if you changed everything, they still struggle into adulthood. And then even as an adult, they have trouble forming relationships. They often develop borderline personality disorders. So it's definitely a huge issue that spawns from the breakdown of the family unit.
Yeah, and so that just goes to show how important the first years of children's lives are.
Yeah.
So you sent over this article, and I found it a fascinating read. The headline was "Mental Health Issues Increase Significantly in Young Adults Over the Last Decade." And in this article, it goes to show that these mental health issues are caused by an increased use of electronic communication and digital media, and a lack of sleep was another reason why. Can you talk about those issues?
Yeah, there's a lot of that has to do with a lack of structure. For whatever reason, boys like electronic things. And I don't know what the science is behind that, but boys are more likely to play video games. They're more likely to interact in that way with the game systems. They're more likely to do video games, especially more so than social media. But they're because there's a lack of structure in the home. I mean, they consider TV, even us 80s kids, TVs were the babysitters, and more so in the younger generations because there's cartoons 24 hours a day now. So that's always constant stimulation, and boys respond well to constant stimulation in general, which is why they do so poorly when there isn't stimulation in the school setting. But so, I mean, TV isn't designed to bore you. It's certainly there for a reason, to attract those viewerships for the commercials and whatnot. I mean, we all know that, but it definitely changes the development of the younger mind, so that they need that constant stimulation all the time, or it's like an hour without it, they're bored. They don't know how to do anything on their own without having some sort of electronic. And girls are like that too now, especially with the cell phones, but it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so because there's no regulation of that in the home setting, a lot of times, I think the best thing to do is only allow them so many hours a day. And I know all the pediatricians, all the experts say that, only allow them so many hours a day on these electronics so that they're not overstimulated by them. But it's not happening. And a lot of times they spend the whole day on these electronics. And so because the stimulation is constant, they don't know how to shut off the mind when it's time to go to sleep. So they just stay up all night playing the games that they were playing all day. And it's just a terrible cycle, because then they get up in the morning to go to school and they're exhausted. They're not learning in class. They're under that anxiety because they're not doing well with their grades. They come home, they just want to escape into the stimulation that they're comfortable with, and it forms this habit that just continues a cycle that they can't kind of get out of. And all of these things, when you have a system, like they develop a system that they have a comfort level in, and then you have all these things trying to influence that system to make them change and to mold them into something else, doing a gradual step down to that process, but basically just saying, no, you need to turn off the PlayStation, or I'm taking it, and then you need to go do your homework for the next hour and a half, or this and this, without having any type of reward base. Just, when it's done like that, it causes so much anxiety because it's such a removal from the comfort of what they're used to, that it can escalate them to a place where they feel like they need to escape. And so many times, I mean, suicide in children is not because their life is so terrible that they cannot think of any other thing to do but to end it. Usually suicide in children is because they're so stressed out or anxious that they just want to escape. And the only way they think of to escape is to end their life. It's no different. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it's similar to running away. Like, kids don't really run away from home anymore the way they used to, because they're too afraid to go out into the world, because they don't have daddies to teach them that it's okay to do that. So you don't really have a lot of runaways anymore. You have more suicide than runaways now. But that's another thing. Like, if they get so overwhelmed by the home environment, by the environment they're in, they'll try to find any type of escape that they can come up with. And quite often, unfortunately, that's the one that they come up with.
Yeah, and so we really need to limit our time, our children's time with these kind of devices, because I can see how parents give these devices to children because, it's kind of all their friends have the phones, and they want to, they really, Mom, come on, give me a cell phone. What, but, there's a lot of danger with that as well. So I think limiting, if you do have a cell phone, limiting the time on it is important, especially, at night, like you said, taking it from them.
Yeah. And I mean, there is that risk of social media sometimes in the younger crowds. Social media can influence them. It's more so with children that have older brothers and sisters that they copy and mimic, that social media can get involved, where they are on Facebook and getting harassed by other kids. You see that more with the teenagers. So it's not so common that is the issue. The social aspect is the issue in the younger crowds. But I think one thing that's definitely coming to a head in these past few years, since at least our new president was elected, that may not be in the lens of the mental health industry right now, but will be, I assure you, in the years to come, is the newfound glory of victimhood. Mental health was a different world in the 90s and in the 2000s. And now in this newer age, it's just not so much something that you talk about in whispers with your friends. It's something that you broadcast with a banner that to say, you have a mental health condition. And it's easier for parents. I mean, over the years, it's just become normalized. Sorry, it's my cat. Over the years, it's become normalized to say you have a mental health condition. So it's easier for parents when their kids go into the hospital and they get diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder. And then the parents can say, oh, see, it's not my fault. My child has a diagnosis. My child has an illness. And mental health is a disease that we should understand and accept, and not think that there's a way to change, because unfortunately there is no cure. Well, they make it so that there's no cure for anything in the mental health industry. So it makes it easier for parents to kind of bring that child into the system. And once they're in the system, they stay in the system. So you see so much more of it. And then they get influenced by outside factors outside of the home. So instead of the parents trying to tell them how to communicate effectively, instead of the dad trying to show them how to safely take risks, instead of the mom being home to offer them comfort after a hard day of school, they're going to group therapies with other children around their age and hearing these other children talk about how they cope with their own issues and getting the advice from their peers instead of their parents. And then their parents are just told to accept that this is the way to effectively manage their illness.
Well, you also sent me an article that talked about why people are dying, or that there was an increase in deaths. And this article in USA Today said more young people are dying by suicide, and experts aren't sure why. And it goes on to say that the suicide rate is increased from 6.8 per 100,000 to 10.7 in 2018. And so that is quite a significant increase in suicide. What are some of those possible factors? I know you listed a few, but maybe give off a few more.
Yeah, and it's hard to speculate, and that's why they're not able to say why as to the definitive cause. But there is definitely some factors. A lack of ability to communicate, I think, is the biggest thing. So many times when I was in the hospital, when we talked to even adults, we'd say, what's going on? Oh, I'm depressed. And when you say, where is the source of this coming from? Just by them expressing all the problems they're having, we can't fix those problems, but just them expressing those problems, processing them vocally, allows them to better come to grips with what's going on, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you talk about something, and as you're talking about it, you kind of piece together and realize what's happening just by vocalizing it. And that's so beneficial to just talk about the problems that you're having. And so many people internalize and don't want to talk about it because oddly, there is this, on one hand, there's this big embrace of mental health. But on the other hand, there's this big stigma against people that talk about themselves. And so many people say, well, we don't want to hear about your problems. We don't want to hear, you need to figure out how to fix yourself. They don't want to hear about the details, but that's such a helpful aspect, is to be able to communicate the things that are causing you to have these thoughts. Just by vocalizing them to another person that has a level of empathy will help to reduce that suicidal ideation. So that's one facet, is just a lack of being able to communicate how you're feeling, either through your own accord because you don't know how to, or because you have a lack of anyone that cares to listen. Another aspect is because there's so much exposure to it now in media and in TV shows. I mean, don't even get me started on the Netflix series that they have that talk about all the glorification of suicide and how it's so socially acceptable now that people do that, and the attention people get when they kill themselves, how there's memorials and they, students speak out about how much they meant to them. And so it makes someone have this feeling that they'll have a sense of belonging after they're gone. So because it's not something that's kept under wraps, it's so much more brought into the open and almost glorified. It encourages that as an outlet or avenue to go to. Peer pressure also, like so many children see other people doing it or seeing other people talking about it. Even my son tells me that he has a friend online that tells him all the time about how he's thinking of killing himself, and my son doesn't know how to deal with it. He doesn't know what to say to him. And so he's being exposed to that. And now he's processing these thoughts, like, why would somebody want to do that? And so that's entering his mind. And it wouldn't surprise me if, he would start thinking those things too, just because he was exposed to it, or, see it on a television show or whatever the case. That's becoming more and more common. And then also just the lack of identity that you see with boys especially, but with everybody, just how the culture of our country is breaking down every aspect of identity that used to exist. So there's no longer, sexual orientation or gender. I mean, those are being torn apart. There's no longer youth and adult. Like they're breaking down the concepts of pedophilia as being wrong. So that's just one avenue. And there's just so many other things that you have to have complete, utter acceptance of every social dynamic. You're not allowed to think of anything as taboo. So nobody really knows what makes them special anymore, because everything's just a melting pot of social acceptance and conformity. Like, you're not allowed to be different, but you're expected to accept differences, which is just such a confusing and jumbled mess for a child who is trying to learn the ways of the world.
Yeah. And so there is that child out there, and someone's listening, that is, really defiant and everything, then they get put into the system. What is that process like?
Okay. Well, I will try not to get long-winded on this, Paul, but it's good to know what happens. So I'm going off of my state. Guidelines might be different in other states, but to be admitted to an inpatient hospital, you either have to be a harm to yourself or others. That's the basic concept. So you either have to be hurting others, which is usually somebody who's psychotic or an uncontrollable, or you have to be either harming yourself in the way that you want to kill yourself or harming yourself in the way that you're cutting yourself, which is kind of newer, but the thing that kids do these days. So once they're admitted, they are removed from their parents. Usually when I would see a child admitted onto my unit, I go up to the parent, schedule a family session because we like to get the families in for therapy. And then they leave the unit and the kid's alone with us. They do not see their parents until they have visitation, which is only 2 hours a night, and they're only limited to 1 hour visitation. So you have the parents completely removed from the equation, except for family therapy, which occurs, it's an hour long, and it usually is once a week. So during the time that they're inpatient, aside from phone calls saying, hey, can you bring me snacks? There's very little interaction with the families, which is such a huge problem because 90% of the time, especially with children 12 and under, the issue lies in the dynamic with the family. I mean, how many times have I said that these kids are in there because of the dynamic of the family, because it's a broken home, because their father's not involved, because the mother's not able to properly allow that kid an outlet for communication. And so we're not teaching the family anything. We're teaching only the child while they're in there. When they first come in, and this is with adults too, the first thing that we do is strip search them, which can be pretty traumatic for a young child. And it was always something that bothered me, but honestly, it had to be done. We would have to go through everything. And even their, especially the adolescents, they're so sneaky. We had a boy that took a disposable razor and broke it open. It had those little strips of razor, and he tucked them into the spine, the inner spine of a book, to use to cut himself once he got into the hospital. So it's like you had to look through everything. We had to turn out pockets, go through all of their belongings, every possession they had. We had to take them down to their underwear. And then we usually had a male. We always had two people in the room. And I tried to always have a male in the room because if it was a male patient, I would turn away and have him bring his underwear down and show us front and back and then pull him back up. But even that is just a horrible thing to do to a child. So, and we did it to adults too. And, you have adults that have sexual abuse history and they have to stand there and take all their clothes off in front of a stranger. It just can be really traumatizing for a mental health hospital. But I understand why they do it. But on the other hand, it's hard. And I don't think parents realize that that's something that the child has to go through. And then what happens is they have anything taken from them that's cords, belts, no toys. They're allowed their clothing, but only certain clothing. Like if it's a sweatpants that have a drawstring, they can't have those unless we cut the drawstring out. They can't have shoes with laces. Anything that they can, a restriction on the things they can have as far as that goes. And then we take them to their rooms for the day. The room is usually a bed and a table and nothing else. It's very stark, barren room because unfortunately you get some crazy kids in there that they'll throw furniture around or they'll scribble all over the walls. And those walls probably had 30 coats of paint on them from all the times the kids scribbled all over them. And then they would join into the activities based on the time of day. If it was in the evening, we'd have them just go right to bed. If it was during the day, we'd get them right into groups. So groups would be involved as there would be one person running activities. This person may have a bachelor's in psychology. They may not. They don't necessarily need to have any experience interacting with children. They just have to have some sort of psychiatric background, or they have to have some sort of hospital background. So you could be a CNA in a nursing home for 2 years and then go work as an activities person in mental health. So a lot of these people are young because they're naive to what they're getting into. The older people don't stick around too long, but they're usually don't have children of their own. And then they do activities that they have at least where I work, they had a binder that had different activity suggestions in it that they would pick from. And so they do very basic activities like on the count of 3, jump on the circle that has a color that expresses your emotion. Stuff like that. They would also have one-to-one time with the nurse where you sit down and talk about, we had a form we had to fill out, but we had 13 a day that we had to fill out. So we have an 8-hour shift, and in that 8-hour shift as a nurse, we had to go meet with 13 patients. And so we had this paper we had to fill out where we say, are you having suicidal ideation? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Can you contract for safety? Meaning that if they feel like they're going to harm themselves, they feel that they can tell somebody before they start to do it. How are you feeling today? Are you anxious? Did you eat? Did you sleep okay? There's never a conversation that says, what brought you to this point that you're sitting in this hospital? How do you talk to your parents when you're struggling at home or at school? These conversations don't happen. They're never really discussed. It's more of, how are you doing today? It's all about what's going on today. What's your affirmation today? We ask about, everyone has an affirmation where they say, today I'm going to go to 3 groups, and that's your goal. And then your affirmation is, I feel like I am artistic. So you say something positive about yourself. And then they meet with the psychiatrist. So the first day they're there, they don't meet with anyone. They meet with them the second day in the morning. They meet with the psychiatrist. He gets a history of what brought them in, and then he prescribes a medication. When we had mental health in the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, a person would stay in the hospital for 30 days or more. There was a lot less admissions back then, a lot less. But when someone got admitted, they were there for 30 days. They worked on themselves therapeutically, spiritually, and holistically before medicinally. We did it was a lot more therapy focused. Now it's the same as an inpatient hospital. You get a knee replacement, they assess you for 2 days, and they send you home with outpatient therapy. That's what the hospital is now. The same thing with mental health, unfortunately. So the doctor spends maybe 15, 20 minutes with the person, determines a medication. Usually for these situations that I have talked about, they start them on Prozac. Prozac is an antidepressant, and it's the only one that has ever been extensively tested in children. Every other medication, except I don't know about the ADHD medications, but every other like psychiatric mood altering medication has not been tested in children except for Prozac. But that doesn't mean Prozac's the only one they put children on, but that's the one they start with. So Prozac, its function is it stops serotonin from being reabsorbed in the brain. So you have serotonin floating around, and serotonin's helping you to feel good, and then it reabsorbs back into the brain and recycles back into the hormonal function. But the drug stops it from being reabsorbed, so it stays in the brain a little longer, and people think, oh, okay, this makes you less depressed because you have your happy drug, your happy hormone in your brain longer. But there's been studies that show that there's very little lasting effect of antidepressants in a lot of people at all. I know some people swear by them, but there's a lot of studies that show that there's very little change between placebo and depressants in extensive studies regarding depression. So I already have a stigma against it. And then every single child that goes inpatient, well, I would say every, but probably 90% of every child that goes inpatient is put on a drug. It's usually an antidepressant to start. Prozac takes 5 weeks to reach its full effectiveness. These kids are in the hospital for at most 2 weeks, usually a week and a half, 2 weeks tops. They go home. The effectiveness that they have, so usually they get put on Prozac. A day later, they go into the doctor. They say, I feel great. Either they're saying that because they hate the place because there's no electronics. They want to go home. Or they're saying that because they're getting placebo effect. Or with the Prozac, there's a mild anti-anxiety aspect to it. So much of these kids' issues are not because of depression as much as they are from anxiety and the ability to escape from that anxiety. So I personally don't think it's so much depression for them, but because they're put on Prozac, which helps with anxiety, they start to feel, and they're being removed from the environment that's been causing them all these issues. So they feel better. And so, okay, the kid comes into the hospital, the kid's put on a drug, the kid's feeling better, the kid gets a little bit of therapy, he mimics back the coping skills that he's taught. Whether he understands them or not is who knows, but he knows to say, punch a pillow if he's angry, which, I mean, I don't know how helpful that is, but that's a coping skill. And then the kid goes home. And then we all scratch our heads when they come back a month and a half later, because nothing has really been resolved. But then the whole cycle repeats and he gets put on another medication. Okay, so Prozac didn't work. So let's put him on Lexapro, which is used for adults and is also used for mood stability in bipolar patients. Or maybe he was already on Lexapro and that didn't work. So let's put him on Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic used for schizophrenic patients, but in lower doses seems to help with mood stability because it's so sedating, it kind of numbs you to your surroundings. I mean, these drugs have lasting effects. There's people I see in hospice that were on lithium their whole lives for bipolarism, and now their kidneys are gone because of the salt in the lithium destroyed their kidneys. So they gain weight. They all gain weight on these medications. They get puffed up because they constantly want to eat. The meds make them hungry all the time. And nothing is ever resolved because there's never a conversation about the whole source of their inpatient hospitalization. Now, I will say this is not all the time, and especially with girls have a lot more success rate in the hospital because just being through that whole experience, they learn to talk about their feelings and to not be forced back into the hospital again. But boys really just struggle, and just going through that over and over again, it makes it worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and they never get at the root cause of the problem. It's just kind of hiding the symptoms.
The people that they see there, they only see for a couple weeks and then they never see again. Then they go to outpatient setting. And some work can be done in the outpatient setting, but usually it involves them going to like a day hospital where they go and again sit in groups with peers and learn through game exercises. But there's and then they might see a therapist once a week for an hour or twice a week, who knows? And that's if the therapist stays on with the company. A lot of times these therapists cycle through. It's only as good as, your therapy is only as good as the therapist you have. And I found that out pretty early on with comparing so many therapists and patients. Some of them have really off the wall ideas on how to care and effectively treat children. So, sometimes they get some really good work. Sometimes they get a really good team that's trying to reform them, but other times they figure out on their own how to get through it.
So how often are these kids just completely insane as compared to they're just bad kids because they're not being taught right?
I think a lot of times it's because they're not being taught right. There are a few. The ones that really have issues are the ones that have reactive attachment disorder. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So it's fascinating. I think it's a fascinating condition, but children develop so much of their social skills in the first 6 months of life, especially in the first 3 months. Their brains are absorbing and expanding faster in those first months than they will for the rest of their lives. So when you have a child who is neglected in those early stages of life, it has a lasting impact on their condition that may not be visible at first. So you see this with children who are in the foster system because they had neglectful parents, or children that are adopted from other countries. Sometimes they're children that are still with their mothers, but their mothers were neglectful to them in their youth. So when they get adopted, we'll just say in the examples from the foster kids and the adopted kids, because that's the most common. So you adopt this kid who might be 6 months old to a year old, bubbly little cherub, and you think nothing of it. This kid goes through a certain developmental stage of life, which I won't get into. It's all, I wouldn't be able to do it without notes anyway, but they go through developmental stage of life until they get to school age. Their developmental processes change once they reach school age, where they have to become more social with others. Like even the first year of life, you put two babies next to each other, they don't play with each other. They play with toys next to each other, but they don't know how to interact with each other. And that's something that they develop. So it's not something that you notice until they get to be about 4, 5, 6, when they're developing those early social skills and going to kindergarten. And then all of a sudden, your kid is being sent home for biting the teacher and you don't know why. Or you're trying to give your kid a hug and he's, punching you and stuff. So reactive attachment disorder is the result of a lack of social interaction and love, basically, in those early stages, but it doesn't manifest until they get to that social interaction stage. So unfortunately, people adopt these children not knowing what they could potentially get into, and then they realize it after the fact, once it starts to manifest. And reactive attachment disorder has a spectrum of condition. Some kids are just have a difficulty forming attachments that they can grow out of as they get older, as they develop an understanding of how to socially interact in the world. Other kids, not so much. And you start to see really bizarre behaviors. Like we had a kid who his mother, his foster or adopted mother, had to lock all of the cupboards in the kitchen because he would eat until he threw up, and then he would eat the stuff he regurgitated. He just could not stop eating. It was bizarre. We had another kid, he was almost feral. Like he would defecate in the corner of his room and then smear it on the walls or stick it in his mouth. And it was just bizarre behaviors. So, that's a weird one.
Yeah. Well, what would be a better solution? So like, let's say you have this kid that's just crazy. What do you do?
They have to have structure. It's the same as with autism, because it's a social interaction skill. The same with autism. Now, autism is a sensory skill, and we don't see a lot of kids inpatient with autism. Figure it out very early on, and they have because autism was so I don't want to say popular, but there's such an awareness made of it. There were so many resources that were developed through the state for parents that have kids with autism. So they have a huge amount of support compared to a kid that has reactive attachment disorder. But it's a similar concept. not so much the sensory aspect, like a weighted blanket isn't going to do anything with a kid with reactive attachment disorder, but they both had that inability to effectively socialize with those that care for them. And the odd thing about RAD kids, reactive attachment disorder kids, you can immediately tell when a kid is a RAD kid, because that's the one that comes up to you and sits down and says, hey, come sit with me. Let's do this activity together, because they interact wonderfully with strangers. They interact horribly with people that love them and are closest to them. They don't know how to interact with people that are that close to them. So a lot of these parents, for someone that doesn't know what a RAD kid does, a lot of these parents get stigmatized by the teachers and stuff, because the teachers are saying, well, this kid's great for me. I have no problems with this child. And then they go home and I hear these reports that, they're beating their mom up, and they think, well, it's obviously something wrong with the mom because this kid's fine for me. But it's actually that the child doesn't know how to effectively communicate with those closest to him or her. So the best way to handle that is through structure, very firm structure, giving them no second chances. They have 3 strikes and they're out, or whatever system you use. A lot of them use a reward-based system with colors. That's what they used inpatient, where they would go on a color system. I think they use that in a lot of schools too, because it's very visual, that they can say, oh, I'm on this color and this is a good color. So doing stuff like that and having that structure can be really helpful. It's more challenging when you're working, when you're not around all the time and that child's in some sort of specialized care. So it's better, and I think from the beginning, from the very early stages of development, it's better to have, the mom at home, unfortunately, all the time to help with that. And I think they almost have to be, depending on how severe the reactive attachment disorder is. They may not even be able to go to school or interact with others if the mom has to be in the home, but that's their best chance for success.
Yeah, and that's, this whole conversation just goes back to the fact that, we need to be there for our children, love our children, guide our children, teach our children, and try to nurture our children in the best way we can, because, once they go down this road where they become bad, it's hard to get them back on track after the fact.
Right. And, so many of the moms, like I just turned 40, but people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, they all grew up in households where their moms worked. I grew up in a single family household. My mom worked. So I wasn't really, fortunately, I stay with my grandmother. So I learned from example through my grandmother on how to be a parent. But when you have children that are through the daycare system, where they're in this daycare setting where they're not allowed to have hugs and affection, like inpatient hospitalization, we were never allowed to hug the children. We were never allowed to have any type of touching with the child. So they were told and taught that affection was not tolerated. And that is often the case in daycares and stuff too, where there's not a lot of affection because there's no personal investment. So these children grow up in the settings where they don't know how to effectively become parents themselves. So they try to do it based on what they learn, which is, kind of a distanced approach. So unless you have a good role model as a child, you're going to grow up to be a parent that doesn't, they don't really have classes, extensive classes on how to better be a parent, unfortunately. So, and then those parents bring about these children that we're having now, which I think is just one more reason why we're seeing the uptick of suicidal ideation, because of a lack of understanding of parenting with the parents.
Well, yeah, and you have to think, like, is these medications, causing some of the suicide as well? What are some of the horror stories that you can think of, and of like a child being put into these systems? Do you have any examples?
Oh, I do have one. Um, and I know I told you before that you have to have a certain mindset to do this job because it can be hard. Um, but there was one example that kind of got to me. We had a kid who, when he was a younger age, and I don't want to go into too many details, his parents died, and he was brought into the care of his aunt and uncle, who did not really care for him. And that was when he was 5. And his first inpatient hospitalization was when he was 5 years old, because after the death, he was having difficulty coping with it. From that point forward, he was inpatient with us multiple times, and he went into residential. So residential is when going inpatient doesn't help. Like, they go through all the systems. They go through inpatient, they go through day hospital, they go through outpatient therapy. They are still having trouble. And this kid, his trouble was more, I mean, he was, it's almost like a Cinderella story. You know, he was not loved and not heard. And there's only so much you can do as an employee that clocks out every night to care and give the attention and love to a child that needs it. He went into residential, which means that he doesn't go home for a long time. So he was inpatient in a residential program for, sometimes they can be in there for up to a year or more. He was in residential at least 2 to 3 times. Then got discharged back to his family. The whole cycle repeated itself, and he went back in again. And as he was getting close to his his later teenage years, like he was getting close to adulthood, we tried so hard to get him to work with his family, and it never really worked out. So they finally were able to relinquish him. The biggest problem with people like doing that is because he was getting Social Security. And this is always a thing. If a child goes into residential, you have to forego child support that goes to the residential. Or if they get Social Security, the Social Security goes to the residential facility instead of to you, because they're providing all of his care, you know? So people often are reluctant to relinquish that financial aspect. And he was getting Social Security for his parents. So his other family did not want to give him up because they didn't want to give up the Social Security. But when he was getting close to the age of adulthood, when he would no longer get Social Security, they finally were willing to relinquish their rights. And he was able to be put into the care of children and youth, which placed him into a boys group, like a boys home, which is actually really positive for him. It was a small home with invested parents, like house parents, not parents, but house parents. So there was only like five boys or so in there. And they were doing some work with him, but he was only there for a couple months, and he was placed in a new school district. And he went to the school the one day and asked a girl to go to dance with him. And she turned him down. And he got upset. Sorry, Paul, this is hard for me to talk about. This is like, it's been like 8 years and it's still hard for me to talk about. He got upset and he left the school. So the student principal, I mean, they had a note of, they were alerted that he eloped. And the student principal, I mean, not the student, I'm sorry, the assistant principal, the vice principal, went after him to try to talk him to come back. And he just kept walking. And the vice principal was right behind him, like, come back to school, let's talk about this. And he took off running. So the guy went after him, calling for him, and he ran to a bridge overlooking a major highway and jumped off of it, and threw himself into the traffic and was immediately hit. And I can't imagine. I mean, that vice principal had 2 children of his own. I can't imagine how he felt witnessing, this child do that. But it was so hard to hear because we had invested so much time into him, and he just could never break away from the shackles of all these years of being oppressed by these people that were supposed to be his family. So, I don't know. A lot of us took it harder than others. A lot of the people at the hospital, we had support groups, we had prayer circles. We all tried to just move on from it, and it actually personally helped me start my journey to Christ, because nobody could really give me a good answer as to why. I mean, I got to this point where I thought, what is the point? What is the point of any of this? Why are we even here doing this when they're just going to jump off a bridge? And my psychiatrist that I worked with said to me, he said, all you can think is that we're in this infinite world of chaos, and all we can do is try to do a little good before we go. And I thought, that's not good enough. There has to be more than that. Yeah. So it did come around for me in the end to help me spiritually, work towards being a Christian. It took a little longer than it should have, because I never had a soul winner knock on my door. So I had to find Christ kind of on my own. But it did help, because I started looking into church and thinking that, there has to be something more spiritual than this, than just, a chaos, and we do what we can. But yeah, I mean, that one always comes to mind when somebody asks a question like that, a horror story, because that was pretty tragic.
Yeah. And, God is, I'm sure, completely absent from any of these discussions. And so, that is the major thing. If people, know Jesus and believe in Jesus, then that'll help them a lot, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
But how often do you see these kids, come to these mental institutions that have a mother and a father in the home? Or is that just never the case?
No, it happens with children under 12. I can't think of many. And if there were, I might think of maybe 1 or 2. There's often mental health in the parents, or the father is away a lot, like a truck driver or something. It's more common with adolescents. And that's because there's outside factors with adolescents. With adolescents, you're developmentally forging that way into the world. I mean, the developmental stage of adolescence is to think the whole world revolves around you, and nobody else can possibly understand what you're going through. That sums up a teenager. Whether they want to be that way or not, that's the way they are. That's how they are developmentally. So those teenagers that come into the unit are often exposed to something in their social setting, in school, or online, something of that nature. So that it takes away from their home environment, because they're trying to branch away from their home environment and forge their way in the world. And so that would bring them impatient. But children are not doing that so much, unless, like I said, they have an older sibling, so they get exposed to that sort of thing. So most often, I mean, 90% of the time, it's always environmental, and it's always the result of a broken home. You just don't see the full family in there with children anymore.
What are some closing thoughts, Sarah? What are some things you want to leave the audience with here tonight?
Well, Gosh, we covered a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what a closing thought would be. It's just important to definitely talk through the way that you feel with others, and don't be afraid to do that. It's so hard to start sometimes when you're so used to bottling everything up, and trying to tell yourself you can handle it yourself when really you can't. So it's so hard to take that first step and say, I need help and I need to talk to somebody. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to go to a hospital and get put on medication, or that you need to see a therapist. You just need to talk to somebody who cares. I always tell my children I'm their number one fan. They'll never hear anything negative from me. They can always come to me about anything. But they still half the time don't want to do that. I don't know. It's just the way kids are. They just feel like mom can't possibly comprehend what I'm going through. So don't be afraid to do that, even if it's to a peer, or to an online support group. I suppose that's better than nothing, although face-to-face is the best way to talk to anyone. I do not recommend the phone therapy like BetterHelp or those phone therapy things. I think face-to-face conversation with a layman is better than spending 30 minutes and $50 with a professional in a text chat. So in any case, I think it's better to develop social interactions too with your children, to give them the time even to sit down for dinner. That's a huge thing. To sit down as a family every night for dinner, to just talk without electronics, like no phones at the table type thing. To have them have that opportunity to be featured, that they can say how their day went and everyone listened to them. Getting into the practice of doing that, at first they're not going to want to, or they're going to be thinking it's weird. But I think with practice over time, it'll make a huge difference. And the more you allow them to have that ability to vocalize, the more they'll be able to do it when they need it. So just communication practices as an adult or as a child, trying to find that way to either allow yourself to communicate with others if you're struggling, or encourage communication with your children to you, is going to be a good way to get them into a place where they can reach for help when they need it, before it gets too much and the anxiety is too high that they are looking for an escape.
Well, I know I'm going to head upstairs right after this interview and give my kids a hug. That's a great tip, though, because we always eat dinner as a family where we sit at the table and eat. But, I never really thought about going around and just asking the kids to all tell them what they did today. That's great advice. I'm going to definitely implement that in my life. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It was awesome.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
It was great. All right.
All right. Well, have a good day and God bless.
Yes.
So that was Sarah Wallace. Man, what a powerful interview. I definitely took away a lot from that interview. I don't even know what to say. I'm definitely going to go upstairs right now and give my kids a big hug and tell them I love them. And, I have all young kids. Luckily, I haven't screwed them up yet. I think they're mentally going in the right direction. But that's why it's important to, start when they're young and stay married. Because the two-family home is key to the future of your children's success. I really do believe that. I want to have more people on to talk about these things. Because it's a way for me to learn too, because I didn't know much about this topic today. Now I do know a little bit, and that's why I want to do these shows. I hope you learned a little bit from today, and Learned a little bit from these articles that we put to you today. Adolescent suicide attempts, how males, especially young boys, have a higher chance of suicide. So thank you guys for tuning in to tonight's program. Make sure to give your kids a big hug. All right, guys. Well, I hope you have a good day, and God bless.
Hey, look at me. I need all of you to help us. Click on the links in the description and subscribe to all our Framing the World backup channels before YouTube bans this one. Thanks for watching.